read your book recently, How to Be a Conservative, and I think it's arguably a serious question: is conservatism still alive at all? Because we've seen in the United States, for instance, conservatism has been reduced to a type of free market economy. It's really an economic conception and not really a moral conception. So maybe we could just start.
Yeah, well, this is one of the worries that intellectual conservatives like me have. There aren't very many intellectual conservatives, it has to be said. We, on the whole, take the view that ordinary people are conservative, but they just don't articulate it. They're not ever pushed into the place where they've got to find the way of expressing their views rather than just having them and acting on them. But when it comes to politics, in a democracy, politicians have to offer things always.
Right.
And that means that there's a natural tendency for them to put their policies and their suggestions in economic terms. They say, you will be so much better off if you vote for us than if you don't. And gradually the language of economics takes over every question, so that it doesn't look as though there's any real distinction between politics and economics. And I think this has actually damaged the conservative position greatly, because precisely what conservatives are trying to say is that there are things that are jeopardized, things that are at risk, precisely because of our modern way of assigning a cost to everything. Right. Of seeing everything in economic terms, the profit and the loss dominating everything, rather than those things that really matter to the spiritual and moral health of the community. So, but you're absolutely right that because of this dominance of the economic question, conservatism tends to be seen as simply an apology for a free market economy, right. Come what may, you know. And so if there's a question about an institution, for instance, what should we do to protect the institution of marriage or primary education or whatever, it gets put into another form, you know. What are the benefits economically, right. of the old idea of marriage? You know, who can answer that question?
You know, one of the things that is troubling to me, Berkeley is probably one of the most educated cities on the planet, just in terms of a sheer number of PhDs, people that have been through high levels of academic training. And a lot of our neighbors are PhDs. We have one of the highest concentrations of Nobel Prize winners. What's really interesting is this is also one of the most liberal cultures in the world. And so the question, and I think a lot of people see this, is that conservatism and intellectualism are almost mutually exclusive. And very often the conservative view is a kind of, it's almost, we've got some troglodytes out there that tend to present conservatism in a way that smacks of an almost anti-intellectual approach. And that's very different from, say, a Burkean type of conservatism, which acknowledged gradualism and the importance of change.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've suffered this all my life, that, well, at least ever since I became a conservative, which was in May 1968 in Paris. Yeah. I didn't know, I hadn't a very clear idea of how to articulate it. All I knew was that when I looked down the street and saw all these rowdy students throwing stones at policemen, I just said to myself, whatever they believe, I believe the opposite. Right. And then I didn't know what it was. And then it was a sort of lifetime's work to find out what the opposite is. So, and I, somewhat arrogantly, came to the conclusion that it's, if you start thinking about politics in an intellectual way, you are likely to be on the left. Because that provides a systematic solution, an answer to the questions, puts it all in a system, and also gives you a rather dignified and self-congratulatory place in the system. But once you started thinking, if you think a bit harder and longer about it, you'll move back to what you would have been if you had never thought at all. You know, and that's my view as what an intellectual conservative is. It's someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons.
Say that again.
Someone who articulates the real reasons for not having reasons, but just feeling and doing what's right.
Right. Well, I think, you know, I think it's Yeats. Yeats has a wonderful poem, Easter 1916. And in there he has the "Come let us mock at the great that had such burdens on the mind and toiled so hard and late to leave some monument behind." He wrote that when he witnessed some Irish revolutionaries destroy a beautiful house of a very wealthy landed English, Anglo-Irish person. And in a lot of ways that poem articulates that idea that it's very easy to destroy and tear down. And I think one of the things that's so tempting for many people, because the world is so troubling to so many people, and so many people suffer in this world, and a lot of what the liberal left tends to rely on is that sense of indignation that a lot of idealistic people feel, because there are things that are deeply wrong with the world. But then when we look historically at how, when these people have gotten into power, whether they're, I mean, people tend to forget that the Nazis were actually, they were quite bohemian in a lot of ways. They had a lot of leftist politics. Certainly their economics was tended to be collectivist, and they were national socialist as opposed to being internationalist. But when they get into power, they tend to really, really tear things down and don't give us
well, I think there's an explanation of this. It's what Hegel calls the labor of the negative.
Right.
That the initial instinct on the left is that negative instinct, you know, that things are wrong. And they must be rectified. They can only be rectified, however, by the seizure of power. And so we're going to seize power in order to rectify them. But once you've got the power, the negative is still there in your heart, because it's driven you all along. You know, that's the thing which has inspired you. So you set about destroying things, punishing people. You find classes who are to blame. You know, the Jews, the bourgeoisie, whoever it might be, and you don't get out of that negative structure. And I feel that's what I felt very strongly in 1968. You know, that of course there are things that are wrong in France, but there are also things that are beautiful and right, and you've got to go through this and come back and rescue those things, which is much more important than destroying a few obstacles along the way.
Right. I mean, one of the things that you talk about in Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands is the idea of power being the way in which everything is articulated. The critique is about power. I mean, Foucault's a good example of that, of somebody who just saw everything in terms of power. But there's definitely truth embodied in that, and I think that's why it's so seductive for so many people. I mean, we have to deal with the fact that so many people are seduced by this because they experience, especially marginalized and disenfranchised people.
Yes, that is true. But of course, in the intellectual world, it's extremely corrupting to see things in this Foucauldian way. You know, instead of asking the question, is what Hamza saying true? I ask the question, you know, what power is advancing behind that? You know, you then disappear from the picture, and also what you've said disappears from the picture. I'm no longer engaging with you, I to thou, at all, because without the concept of truth, there is no real engagement between people. All I am seeing is the power that's speaking through you, and that, of course, you can look at the whole of culture in that way, which is essentially what the postmodern curriculum is, taking one writer, one philosopher, one musician after another, and just talking about, you know, like Susan McClary on Beethoven. This is fantasies of rape speaking through this music. You know, it's extremely boring after a while because it's totally mechanical.
It's a lens. I mean, one of the things I say about critical theorists, you know, that if it was a lens that it might be useful sometimes to just peer through that lens, but it's a corneal transplant.
That's,
you know, and
that's a good metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes the only way.
Yes.
And I've seen, one of the things that I've seen with students in my own teaching experience is, you know, I've had critical theorists in my classes, and whenever they raise their hand, I could almost verbatim tell them what they're going to say,
Yes.
the response that they're going to give to whatever was said.
Yes.
And
well, then we need to understand why it is so seductive.
That's my point. It troubles me how seductive it's been, and it also, I grapple in my own self with the amount of genuine injustice in the world that takes place on a daily basis. And I mean, for instance, you know, their attacks on capitalism, to me, the corporate world today is so powerful, and to use a favorite term in that world is hegemonic. You know, this idea where monoculture becomes so imperious, and we've seen so many. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was young, one of the treats in my experience was to go to a bookstore. Bookstores have pretty much been wiped out in the United States because of these corporations. So small bookstores are not able to survive. So now you had Borders, but then Borders goes bankrupt, and then now we're left with Barnes and Noble, and so if you go in, who's picking those books? Who's actually choosing what books? Like if you go, for instance, to the teen section, it's almost all about vampires and really weird occultic stuff. It's not like, you know, the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew mysteries. It's very corrosive ideas. And
we've slightly changed the topic now. We're not really talking about this postmodern obsession with power.
Right.
We're talking about change in the structure of life.
Right. But for me, a lot of, I mean, I'll give you an example. Herbert Marcuse, who I'm not a fan of by any stretch, but when I read some of his works, I was struck by real insights about things that were very troubling about American culture. One-dimensional man, this idea of a consumer and life as consumption, and losing meaning. I mean, his solutions is a whole other problem. And this is something I think that's very seductive, is that the critical aspect of Marxism and neo-Marxism has always been, it's always had a resonance in a lot of people. There's something very, very powerful about it. When you get to solutions and how we deal with these things, we're in another realm. But if I think if conservatives don't really address the real serious critiques that are there about the status quo. Yeah,
I think you're right. They have perhaps neglected those critiques, but you know, as I was saying earlier, the purely negative approach to the status quo is simply going to perpetuate this negativity, and has done. If you're not, the typical conservative, in my reading of events, is someone who looks around himself and he finds things that he loves, you know, and he thinks, well, those things are threatened, they're vulnerable, I've got to protect them. And it's not often that you find on the left somebody who looks around and finds things that he loves. It's always something that's gone wrong, something that is even hateful, and you've got to mobilize against it. If you've lost any sense that actually the world is lovable and that there are things therefore to be rescued in it, you have actually lost the sense of why there is such a thing as a community in the first place. And that, I think, is one of the things that I felt very strongly throughout my life, that there really are wonderful things that we've inherited. All Americans, however, whatever position in society they are still heirs to something rather remarkable. You know, a rule of law which goes on perpetuating itself from generation to generation. If only people knew how rare that was, they would see that they've got to fight to preserve it. You know, and the same with so many other institutions that we inherited.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think one of the most one of the most interesting things, and Gwyn, we were talking about Gwyn earlier, the grammarian. One of the things that Gwyn points out, and it really struck me in his little book on grammar that made quite a splash, I think, in the UK. One of the things that he points out is that language, our English language, has not changed a great deal. I mean, the conservation of the language, because there's a lot of people, the descriptivist will just say that language is whatever people use. But there is a reason to hold on and to preserve language, because if we allow language to dissipate into private languages, we lose the ability to communicate as a culture or a civilization.
That is all true, but also equally true is the fact that language as we inherit it is not the product of a single person. It's the evolved gift of generations, and contained in every word there is a kind of history of the human condition. We're actually inheriting wisdom with language. These words make distinctions that we couldn't have ever made ourselves without their aid. And but we are entering a world where grammar is not given the importance that it deserves.
One of the things, for me, I mean, conserving language is extremely important, and it was an obsession of Muslims. The idea, the Quran, in essence, almost froze the Arabic language in a period. So the ideal of Arabic will always be the Quran, and in some ways the King James Bible did that to English to a certain degree.
Yes, it did. But interestingly, of course, the King James Bible isn't unashamedly a translation, and the Quran hasn't. Most Muslims don't accept that it can be exactly translated because it has a perfection of its own. Of course, it was recited. I mean, you know more about this than me. It was recited long before it was written down, and then it had achieved a kind of statuesque quality that our Bible has never managed. But grammar. The grammar of the King James Bible is often quite unorthodox, and it's a very strange book, and we now it is the book that made our 17th and 18th century literature. There's no doubt about that.
Arguably, it's the book also that made some of the greatest orators in our civilization.
Yes.
I mean, Lincoln's reliance and dependence on the King James Bible was immense.
But hardly any church now uses it.
Right.
My church, the Anglican Church, does use it. But only in certain little places, and in villages or in high ceremonial occasions. I mean, for the most part, it's the New English Bible that has replaced it.
You went to grammar schools, and they've been largely. The attack on grammar schools has been amazing because it's been seen as an elitist enterprise. And one of the things that struck me, I read a book by David Mulroy called The War Against Grammar. It was quite an eye-opening book for me, because one of the things that in teaching our students Arabic, it's very difficult because many of them have very little English grammar. And traditionally grammatical languages, I mean all languages are grammatical, but by that I mean a language that is almost impossible to understand without knowledge of grammar, like Arabic, because it's inflected and because the verbs are conjugated. And so if you don't have some understanding of that, it becomes very difficult. But David Mulroy makes this argument that in the 1960s, early 60s in the US, there was actually a movement to stop teaching grammar, and they saw it as very abusive to children. But what's interesting, he has something that I've replicated in several classes. On average, I'll take 50 students. I give them the opening sentence to the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary. To the end of that sentence, it's a sentence that has several subordinate clauses, and all I ask the students is identify the main point of this sentence. Now, these are college students. On average, out of 50 students, I'll get 2 or 3 that actually can identify the main clause. And so there's a type of higher illiteracy that the fact that grammar has been removed. And I think a restoration of language is the only thing. For me, the salvation of a civilization has to be predicated on the resurrection of the corruption of its language.
Well, I think you've actually touched on what the real essence of conservatism is there. You know, that there are things that the conservation of which is actually fundamental to understanding the world as it is.
Right.
And if you lose those things, like the rules of grammar, the habits of good speech, or good manners, the sense of what a legal solution as opposed to a mere bullying solution to a conflict might be, all those things we used to be taught to us as part of becoming an adult. If you lose those things, you're at sea in the world. And I think that's one of the things that that most worries me about modern education. You refer to this movement in our schools to abolish grammar as elitist. It's absolutely true that grammar is elitist because it makes a distinction between the people who know it and the people who don't.
Right.
And that's the kind of distinction that we all need if we're to survive,
Right.
not only as a civilization, but as individuals too.
Right.
So this is where the real arguments for conservatism, in my view, should be based, not in the economic sphere at all, but in these fundamental cultural inheritances.
One of the things in our tradition, in the Islamic tradition, was very interesting to me, is they have this concept of what they call the mushdub salik, whose the goal in the spiritual tradition of Islam is to be inwardly in a state of ecstasy, but outwardly in a state of sobriety. And so there's this very interesting Dionysian Apollonian balance that's actually taking place. And I think one of the things that happens in a culture that loses the ability to experience internal ecstasy, like to you know,
where it is, I mean, comes from the soul.
I mean, I'll give you an example. I've been reading a book called Videocracy, which is about viral videos online, and there was a video that went viral by this guy named Bear Vasquez, and it was him seeing a double rainbow outside of his house, and he's just in a state of just awe, and then he starts crying. He breaks down and just starts crying, and he's asking, what does this mean? And there's something very powerful about that. Is such an appropriate response to a double rainbow. And I think whatever happened, it resonated in a lot of people, what he was seeing. And I think our culture no longer gives people vehicles for the experience of joy.
Now that's a really important point. Pleasure has driven out joy.
Exactly.
Because joy is essentially something which comes from your deep social nature, from your need for others and your need to give to others.
Yes.
And I think that I've often, you know, the problem is we're agreeing about too much, but I see this in the change in patterns of dancing. The dancing that I love, like Scottish country dancing and you know, formation dancing.
So I had to do Greek dancing as a child.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, they are full of joy because they are ways of relating to others, forgetting about your appetites, just being with. Whereas modern, you know, head bash smashing.
It's solipsistic.
It's solipsistic and narcissistic. And narcissism is joyless because it concentrates only on what can be received and not what can be given.
Well, the other thing what's fascinating too about that, because I thought about dibke with Lebanese dancing, Syrian dancing, which is very similar to Greek dancing.
That's right.
And one of the things about that type of dancing is that there's a formalism that's very rigid, but within that formalism, once you master it, you're allowed to improvise and do certain things. There's a freedom that comes. And there was something that my father used to always say about the liberal arts, is that the purpose was this immense discipline that set you free. That through that structure and discipline, you actually become free. And I think this conflation of freedom with licentiousness and freedom with do what thou wilt, the kind of the thelema, you know, the abbey of thelema, this idea that that we can just simply do what we want, and that's how we're going to find happiness.
No, you're absolutely right. There's a false idea of freedom which took over the world in the 60s in a way, with the baby boomers. We don't know quite why, but this idea that freedom means the absence of control,
Well, Plato would say it was a change. The absence of control rather than
an order in the soul.
Right.
You know, my ideal of freedom is something like Bach's Art of Fugue, in which every note is necessary, but every note is totally free. You know, that idea that there is an order which reveals itself through free gestures. That's really what you're saying about those old Mediterranean styles of dancing.
Yes. I think it's also rhetoric was like that. I mean, Shakespeare, Miriam Joseph wrote a dissertation, Shakespeare and the Arts of Language, where she proved that he had mastered all of these rhetorical treatises of his time, and knew over 200 tropes and schemes. It's amazing, and often borrowing from the very text that he had mastered. So the artifice, which used to be a kind of positive term in the past, this idea of craft, of real craftsmanship. And I think the two areas where we still see it in our culture to a certain degree, I mean, popular music is very troubling in a lot of ways, but I think you still see it in music and sports, athletics.
You see it in jazz improvisation, of course.
Yes.
Which doesn't make sense at all until you've mastered the chord sequence and can hear the hidden melody in the improvisation.
Yes. So in sports, people go to these stadiums or they watch on television. What they're waiting for is that magical moment. You know, the triple play in baseball.
Yeah.
I don't know what they have the equivalent in cricket is.
I think hitting something for six or something. I don't know.
Right. But there's a moment where and people look at each other as if they've just witnessed a miracle.
Yes.
But that can only happen because of an immense discipline that occurred, and we've lost that. We've lost that in so many other areas of being human.
But again, we can get it back, and we have got to be optimistic about this.
Well, for us in our tradition, it's considered an obligation to be hopeful.
Yes. Well, of course, likewise for Christians, faith, hope, and charity are the three fundamental virtues. Meaning by charity,
love,
caritas. A certain kind of love, yes. But that's another problem. That idea of love has become so corrupted.
Well, it's
the
Greeks had that nice distinction.
Yeah, between agape and eros, and all the other sorts of love too.
Arabs do that as well.
Yeah.
Arabs have 10 different types of love.
Oh, right.
The highest being khalla.
Right.
The lowest being ishq, which is the actually it's desire. Yeah, eros.
Yeah, but hib is still quite a good thing.
It's a beautiful thing, and it's related. It's cognate of another word, which is seed. That love is something that is nurtured and grows.
Right.
Because hab is seed, and hub is love.
Right.
Yeah.